So this is a short homily about trying to forgive really difficult things, and I'll use an example of a friend of mine about how I can try and make a start on this, because it's not easy. And I suppose the biblical cue for how to do it is a conversation Peter has with Jesus, and Peter asks him, how often should you forgive? How often should you forgive? And he then comes up with a number. He says, should I forgive maybe as many as 7 times? And I think if someone went, you asked someone up the street, he said, how many times should you forgive someone? I mean, everyone thinks you should forgive them the first time. Second time, probably. I reckon an ordinary person would kind of do 3 strikes and you're out. They'll forgive you, twice, and the third time you've got to move on. And Peter says, what about 7 times? And there may be some rabbinic parallels to this, but I think he goes 7 times because, well, Jesus is pretty holy. 3 would be a bit normal. He's a holy guy, maybe 7 times. And then Jesus famously does this reply. He says, not 7, but 70 times 7. Or in some translations, 77 times. I don't think the number really matters. I think what matters is just a lot and a lot more than you think you have to do it. And I've tended to understand this in terms of a lot of small things, a lot of small things you have to forgive, you have to keep on forgiving. But I had a really interesting conversation with a colleague who'd had to try to forgive something big. And I'll come back to how the number of times to forgive is relevant to this situation. He's a priest like me, and he went into training a few years ago, but just before he went into theological training, which is he went to a residential college, which a lot of us do, he had this really bad experience. He had beforehand worked in the city, so he'd had a relatively high paid job, and he knew when he'd be going into ministry that it'd be relatively low paid, but he kind of built up a nest egg, if you like, so sort of life savings, and he knew that that's something he could draw on in the future, maybe for buying a house when he was retired, and he worked quite hard to build that up. And he had actually used a private investor, someone you get these investors to invest the money for him, and that was going to be his kind of life savings, for whatever it was needed. And then he found out that just when he'd resigned his job, he'd moved on, he was into training. Unfortunately, the person who he had entrusted his savings to was a fraud, was a crook, and this person had taken the savings and he had spent them. And the bottom line is these life savings were gone. And you could go to him and think, well, that was an unwise thing to do. I bet he was thinking that. But he suddenly experiences someone just, not just stealing a fiver, this is your life savings. And it had a peculiar life circumstance because it happened at the same time as he just started training for ministry. And if you've gone training to ordination to theological college, but one of the things we're always trying to be good people, but I think especially when you're at college, you're really trying to be a good person. You're trying to move from this phase of just being a member of the laity to an ordained member of the church, someone who's really representative of Christ. And so he's got this massive problem and, kind of anger, but he realises he is called to forgive this person. So what he did was he prayed really hard to ask God to help me forgive the person who'd stolen his life savings and had lost them. And he did this, and at the end he thinks, okay, well, I prayed hard for him, and I feel okay about it. The next day he wakes up, furious with this bloke. He's still angry with him. How could he possibly have done this? And so he realises that although he had asked God to help him forgive this person, it just hasn't worked. He's still angry. He's still got this fury. So he thinks, well, I better stick at it. So he prays again to ask God to help me forgive this person. Please may I forgive this person. The next day, despite the fact that he prayed hard the day before, he's still furious with the person. He can't shake this anger. And this goes on, and it's a real struggle because he knows he ought to forgive. Part of him wants to forgive, but he does. After all these prayer times, the next day he wakes up and he is still kind of angry. And this goes on for a long time, and he's still praying and he's still waking up. And then he said, one day, 3 years later, I woke up and I realised I had forgiven him. It was like gone. This kind of burden of anger had gone. He had forgiven this person who'd taken all his money. And of course it doesn't solve the problem, he's got no life savings, but the forgiveness is genuine. And listening to my colleague's story made me realise something, that this question about how many times should I forgive, once, twice, 3 times, whereas I'd always understood it as forgiving new things, sometimes in order just to forgive one big thing, you have to forgive hundreds of times before you can get to the point of really feeling forgiveness. So when Jesus says 70 times 7, as in just countless, it may not be for lots of little things and continue to forgive in that way. That numberlessness time of forgiveness is what will enable you to forgive the one big thing. It's not easy, but the gift my friend has got now is, having lost it, it's not kind of consuming him, it's not eating away at him. He has forgiven. And I think it's quite an inspiring example in terms of how to live out Jesus' teaching, not just for the little grievances we have, but for the really big things it's hard to shift. In his case, it just took 3 years of trying, but eventually he got there.